You think moving back to a quiet valley cabin would be peaceful. You think the past is behind you. But the moment I drove down that winding mountain road, I had no idea that the very people who once tried to control my life were about to lose it completely. Years had passed since I last saw the valley. The narrow road snaked through towering pines and golden meadows, and every bend seemed to whisper memories I thought I had left behind. My old cabin, tucked deep into the hillside, had been abandoned for years, its once charming facade weathered and faded, yet somehow it retained a quiet dignity. Returning felt surreal. I had imagined this moment countless times, but the reality struck with a mixture of nostalgia and anticipation. The valley, once a symbol of freedom and solitude, had become a stage for unspoken rivalries and petty control. I knew the HOA, especially the notorious Karen, had made my previous visits a living nightmare. She had been relentless, enforcing every minor rule with a ferocity that bordered on obsession. Yet, here I was, the sole owner of the very property she thought she could dictate. The power dynamics had shifted, though she had no idea yet. As I drove past familiar landmarks, the cracked mailbox at the corner, the rusty swing hanging from the old oak tree, the stone path leading up to my cabin, I could see that the valley had aged along with me. But in the quiet, there was a palpable tension. The neighbors had gotten used to the absence of the cabin's rightful owner, and the air seemed heavy with unspoken gossip. Every glance from the windows along the road felt like it carried a question: who's back? I parked at the edge of the driveway, my heart pounding in a mix of excitement and vindication. The cabin had endured storms, overgrown ivy, and years of neglect, but it still stood firm. Walking up the familiar steps, I could almost feel the cabin recognizing me, welcoming me back, like a loyal friend. This was no longer just a retreat, it was a statement. From a distance, I noticed her. Karen. The self-appointed queen of the valley. She was on her usual morning rounds, clipboard in hand, inspecting neighbors' properties with the precision of a drill sergeant. Her posture stiffened when she spotted me, like the air itself had shifted, alerting her to the return of someone she thought she could control. There was a flash of recognition in her eyes, followed by disbelief. She had expected a ghost, a memory, someone who had quietly disappeared. But I was here. I took my time, letting the moment linger. Every step up the porch echoed with history, the petty arguments, the unfair notices, the moments she tried to dictate the lives of those around her. I had endured it all once, and now the power was in my hands. The quiet of the valley, once oppressive under her watchful eyes, now belonged to me. Every tree, every winding path, every sloping hill was mine. As I pushed open the cabin door, the familiar scent of aged wood and pine filled the air. Dust danced in the sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating the memories of past summers. It was peaceful, yet charged with a sense of inevitable confrontation. The cabin had always been a sanctuary, but now it also represented victory, proof that the authority she wielded so freely was nothing compared to rightful ownership. Karen, still on the road below, seemed frozen in place. She scanned the property, her mouth opening slightly as if to speak, then closing again. She had seen this cabin abandoned for years, expected it to rot quietly, expected its owner to fade from memory. But here I was, a living reminder that control and entitlement had limits, that the valley belonged to those who claimed it, not to those who policed it. I began unpacking slowly, savoring the moment. Boxes filled with memories, furniture from better times, and personal items from years ago returned life to the cabin. Each placement, each careful arrangement, sent a silent message. This was my space, my rules, and no one, especially not Karen, would dictate otherwise. Outside, she began moving along the street, perhaps gathering courage, perhaps calculating her next move. And then, as the sun dipped low behind the mountain peaks, I realized something. This was not just about returning to a home, it was about rewriting the story. Every inch of this valley, every road, every neighboring cabin, was now part of a narrative she had never imagined. I owned it all, and the truth of that fact would soon make waves. The air seemed to thrum with anticipation. Shadows lengthened across the valley, carrying with them the promise of confrontation. Karen's disbelief was palpable, but the real story was just beginning. I had returned, not just to live, but to reclaim. The valley had changed, the cabin had changed, and perhaps most importantly, I had changed. And the next morning would reveal just how unprepared she was for the reality of who really owned the valley. The first morning after my arrival, the valley seemed deceptively calm. Sunlight filtered through the towering pines, painting the meadows in gold and green, yet an invisible tension hummed in the air. From the cabin window, I could see Karen pacing along the road, her posture rigid, her movements precise but erratic, betraying a mind in turmoil. She had always thrived on control, on knowing every detail of every neighbor's life. But now, that control had slipped through her fingers. She approached the entrance to the valley, clipboard in hand, expecting a routine, an absentee owner, a cabin still abandoned, a story that could be easily dismissed. Instead, she found me arranging my property as if I had never left. Every box I carried, every corner I dusted, seemed to send an unspoken message: this was no longer her territory. I owned it. The realization hit her slowly, like a tide creeping over her carefully constructed authority. Her steps faltered, and the usual confident scowl gave way to something closer to disbelief. Neighbors, who had long grown accustomed to her domineering presence, started to notice the shift. Cars slowed along the road as people craned their necks, peering over fences and through windows. Whispers rippled from yard to yard, conversations about the sudden, unmistakable assertion of ownership, about the unexpected return of someone who had vanished years ago. Karen's fury, tempered by surprise, radiated outward, infecting the usually serene valley with a new, tense energy. She circled the driveway cautiously, as though approaching a wild animal, trying to assess the situation. In her mind, she replayed every rule she had ever enforced, every notice she had sent, every confrontation she had orchestrated. None of it mattered anymore. The property she had once sought to police was now legally mine, and the power she had relied upon evaporated in an instant. Her authority, long assumed unchallenged, was suddenly irrelevant. I watched her from the cabin, letting the moment linger. Every detail mattered: the tilt of her head, the tightening of her jaw, the almost imperceptible frown lines deepening across her face. I didn't need to speak, she already understood that something fundamental had changed. The valley was no longer hers to control, and the very rules she wielded like weapons were powerless against ownership. The subtle dynamics of the neighborhood began to shift almost immediately. Other residents, long intimidated or complicit, started moving with newfound caution. There were quiet exchanges in driveways, furtive glances behind curtains, and the low murmur of voices where once there had been silence. Karen's aura of dominance, once unquestioned, had been punctured by a single fact: I now held the ultimate authority. The valley belonged to me. I moved through the cabin with deliberate purpose, each action a silent declaration. Furniture was placed with precision, walls were dusted, windows were polished to a reflective sheen. Every corner radiated an unmistakable presence of ownership. Outside, Karen stopped, taking notes she didn't intend to show anyone. The clipboard, once a symbol of her power, felt almost meaningless in her hands. She had no recourse, no leverage, nothing that could negate the simple truth: the valley and its cabins were mine. Hours passed with the sun rising higher, casting long shadows across the rolling hills. Karen's pacing continued, a nervous energy radiating from her like heat off asphalt. It was as though every step she took was an attempt to recalibrate reality, to convince herself that the laws and bylaws she had enforced were still relevant. They weren't. Nothing in her toolkit could undo the legal documents that placed the property firmly in my hands. By mid-morning, it became obvious to the neighbors. Karen's agitation was palpable. She wasn't just upset, she was unmoored. The woman who had dictated the valley's rhythm was now reacting to someone else's tempo. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. Did you see her face? She looked like she'd been caught in a storm. I can't believe she's back, and she owns the whole valley. Each whisper, each observation, fanned the flames of tension. Meanwhile, I stood at the cabin porch, surveying the valley below. It was a quiet kind of triumph, one that needed no acknowledgement. The hills, the trees, the winding roads, they were all mine, legally, and finally, morally. Karen's disbelief was almost satisfying in its rawness. The once intimidating HOA queen was confronted not with negotiation, not with debate, but with a reality she could not deny. Ownership had shifted, and with it, the balance of power. As the day drew on, subtle maneuvers began. Karen would stop, scribble something on her clipboard, then resume pacing. I could see the gears turning, the internal calculations she was making about influence, about control, about rules that now seemed meaningless. Her efforts to assert herself were met with silence from the cabin, a physical representation of the power she had lost. The sun began its descent behind the valley hills, casting golden light over the landscape. Shadows lengthened, and the sense of an impending confrontation lingered in the air. Karen's movement slowed, her agitation simmering but unresolved. She could see, very clearly now, that the story of the valley had changed, forever. And in that realization, the stage for conflict was set. The quiet was deceptive. Beneath it, tension coiled like a spring. The next days promised a battle of wills, a clash of authority, and a reckoning that would leave the valley forever altered. I had returned not simply to inhabit my cabin, but to reclaim every inch of the valley that had been denied to me. And Karen, for the first time, had no answers. By the third morning of my return, it became painfully clear that Karen would not accept the new reality quietly. Her once commanding presence, now tainted with shock, had evolved into something more dangerous: relentless determination. She moved with a precision that betrayed her obsession, scanning every inch of the valley as if to memorize where she might strike, where she could reassert control. The clipboard she wielded like a weapon was now filled with frantic notes and scribbles, plans that seemed increasingly futile. Neighbors watched from behind lace curtains and neatly trimmed hedges, sensing the brewing storm. Some whispered cautiously about the confrontation, while others speculated on Karen's next move. The tension was contagious. The entire valley seemed to hold its breath as the woman who had policed the neighborhood for years prepared her first strike. Her fury was a force of nature, and everyone knew it. Karen's actions were methodical at first. Notices were drafted, emails composed, and phone calls made to rally support. Every action was designed to intimidate, to assert that she still had authority, even as the law, the property deeds, and undeniable ownership all stood firmly in my favor. But I had anticipated her reaction. I knew her patterns, her obsession with control, and I had no intention of yielding. From the cabin porch, I could see her moving along the valley roads, clipboard clutched tightly, stopping at neighbors' homes with a rehearsed politeness that barely concealed her frustration. She approached each person as if to recruit allies, to remind them of her self-appointed reign, but the effect was diminished by a subtle but undeniable truth: my ownership had shifted the balance. Those who once feared her were now cautiously reassessing their loyalties. By midday, she escalated further. Karen issued her first official HOA notices, posting them conspicuously in the yards of neighboring homes. The papers were immaculate, perfectly typed, but hollow. Each notice carried demands, threats of fines, and references to regulations that no longer applied to me. The irony was sharp: she was enforcing rules that had no bearing over the very person who owned the property at the center of her obsession. Despite her meticulous efforts, the momentum was slipping from her grasp. I moved deliberately through the cabin, organizing and arranging my belongings, a silent counter to her frantic energy. Every deliberate action, a polished window, a repositioned piece of furniture, a tidy yard, was a statement of ownership. Each small victory was a reinforcement of reality: I was here, I belonged, and the valley now operated on my terms. Word spread quickly. Social media posts from residents, innocent in tone but laden with curiosity, captured Karen's increasingly frantic attempts to reassert herself. The valley became a stage where the drama unfolded in real time: photos of her pacing, whispering to neighbors, waving papers, and scowling at the cabin. The irony was unmistakable to all who watched: a woman used to absolute control was struggling to comprehend a world in which she had none. By the afternoon, Karen had escalated her tactics even further. Phone calls became a flood, each one attempting to intimidate or guilt neighbors into compliance. Her tone, once confident and condescending, now carried a sharp edge of desperation. She referenced outdated rules, old precedents, and even invented minor violations, hoping that fear might sway opinion. But the reality of ownership, verified legally and visible in every aspect of the cabin's revival, rendered her efforts ineffective. From the cabin's upper deck, I watched her. Her agitation was palpable, every movement exaggerated, every gesture calculated but fraying under pressure. She had underestimated the power of rightful authority, the quiet confidence that comes with being in control of one's domain. And with every failed attempt to rally the valley, her frustration grew, coiling tighter around her like a spring ready to snap. The neighbors, long accustomed to living under her watchful gaze, began to test the new dynamics. A few tentatively walked past the cabin, nodding politely, while others lingered at the edge of their yards, curious but cautious. The subtle but undeniable shift in the balance of power made the valley feel different, charged with the electricity of an inevitable confrontation. Karen, hyper-focused and increasingly erratic, was oblivious to the silent observation around her. Evening brought no relief. The sun dipped behind the hills, casting the valley in a golden, almost cinematic light, highlighting every curve of the land, every tree, every home. Karen's shadow stretched across the road as she scurried between houses, muttering to herself, scribbling notes, and checking her phone repeatedly. Her obsession with control, once steady and unwavering, now appeared almost frantic, a stark contrast to my calm, deliberate movements inside the cabin. By nightfall, the tension had reached a fever pitch. The valley had transformed from a serene, pastoral landscape into a theater of silent warfare. Karen had made her first public moves, but they had only reinforced her vulnerability. I had returned not merely to occupy my cabin, but to reclaim the narrative of the valley itself. Every glance, every whispered conversation, and every cautious step by the neighbors confirmed that the scales of authority had shifted irrevocably. And yet, despite her mounting frustration, Karen was far from finished. This battle, though already tilted in my favor, had only just begun. The quiet tension of the valley promised even greater confrontations, with strategies and counter-strategies poised to unfold in the days ahead. I could feel it. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, every distant car moving along the winding roads carried the anticipation of what would come next. Karen's disbelief had evolved into full-blown determination. By the fourth day, her efforts had escalated beyond mere intimidation. Legal notices littered the valley, each stamped and sealed with the HOA logo she wielded like a weapon. She had spent hours drafting letters that cited obscure rules and regulations, rules that now had no authority over my ownership. Each notice was carefully crafted to appear official, yet they carried a desperate energy, betraying the futility underlying her actions. Neighbors began to notice a pattern in her movements. Karen visited homes repeatedly, clutching her clipboard as if it were a shield, reciting the same points over and over, and pressing for support that was no longer guaranteed. Some cautiously nodded, others offered sympathetic smiles, but the undercurrent of skepticism was unmistakable. Everyone could see the discrepancy between her authority and the truth of ownership. The valley, which had once adhered to her every word, now watched silently as her credibility eroded with every attempt. Meanwhile, I moved deliberately through the cabin, attending to every detail that reinforced my presence. Each polished surface, each organized space, acted as an unspoken testament to my claim. The cabin was no longer just a structure, it was a symbol of legitimate control. Karen's letters, notices, and phone calls could not erase the simple, undeniable fact that I owned the valley's centerpiece property. The visual demonstration of authority, my calm, precise presence, was far more compelling than any document she could muster. Karen's tactics shifted into psychological warfare. She began arriving unexpectedly, peering over fences, observing from a distance, and muttering to herself as though her mere presence could intimidate me into compliance. Her movements were meticulous, calculated, and repetitive, an obsessive pattern designed to unsettle. Yet, every step she took only reinforced the perception of desperation. The neighbors noticed her agitation, whispers spreading from one yard to the next, creating a ripple effect of curiosity and apprehension. With the legal approach proving ineffective against the straightforward fact of ownership, Karen attempted to create bureaucratic obstacles. She contacted county offices, questioned property lines, and tried to stir disputes over easements and access rights. Hours were spent on hold, writing emails, gathering signatures, every action intended to buy leverage, to sow doubt, to intimidate. But the outcome was always the same: documentation verified, ownership confirmed, and authority firmly in my hands. The valley itself seemed to respond to the tension. Even the natural elements, the tall trees, the golden meadows, the winding roads, felt heightened under the charged atmosphere. Birds seemed to hesitate mid-flight, leaves shimmered more vividly in the sunlight, and the wind carried a sense of expectancy. Karen's obsession had turned the valley into a stage, and every resident, every passerby, became an unintentional audience to the unfolding power struggle. As the week progressed, Karen grew more erratic. Her visits to the cabin became frequent and intrusive, always under the guise of legality or neighborhood concern, yet the pattern was clear. She had lost the quiet confidence she once exhibited, replaced by frantic attempts to reassert control. Every unanswered knock at the cabin door, every ignored glance, seemed to erode her resolve further. Each failed tactic chipped away at her authority, leaving only the image of a woman confronting the limits of her power. In parallel, I took measured steps to reinforce my position within the community. Casual walks along the winding roads, brief conversations with neighbors, and visible maintenance of the property, all small gestures that communicated presence, stability, and legitimacy. The contrast between my calm, deliberate actions and Karen's frantic maneuvers created a stark narrative, one of rightful ownership versus misplaced entitlement. By the end of the week, the legal tactics had reached their peak intensity. Letters piled up, emails were sent to the county offices, and Karen's presence became increasingly conspicuous. Yet, despite the appearance of effort, the results remained unchanged. Ownership was unassailable, the cabin was thriving under my stewardship, and the valley itself seemed to lean subtly in favor of those who observed the drama unfold. Karen's frustration was now an almost tangible presence, visible in her gestures, the pace of her steps, and the increasingly wild expressions on her face. The neighborhood, long accustomed to living under her domineering gaze, began to adjust to the new dynamic. Some approached me cautiously, curious about the shifts taking place, while others simply observed, waiting to see who would emerge victorious. The quiet authority of ownership was slowly taking root, and Karen's repeated attempts at legal intimidation only highlighted her diminishing influence. The tension between the two opposing forces, entitlement versus legitimacy, had reached a plateau. Karen's obsessive attempts to regain control through legal channels had failed repeatedly, while my deliberate, measured actions reinforced my authority in a subtle but undeniable way. Every passing day, every careful movement, every visible act of ownership further cemented the reality that the valley now belonged to me. As the sun set over the valley, casting long shadows across the rolling hills, Karen's efforts began to take on a surreal quality. Her legal papers, her frantic notes, and her repetitive visits painted a picture of relentless obsession, yet they could not compete with the simple truth of possession. The valley had shifted beneath her feet, and there was no reversing it. The stage was set for the next escalation. Karen's obsession with authority had only intensified, and the neighborhood was fully aware of the stakes. The battle was far from over, but the trajectory was clear. Ownership and control had collided, and the outcome would soon become impossible to ignore. Karen's increasingly erratic behavior had begun to ripple through the valley, and the residents were no longer mere observers, they were participants in an unspoken contest of allegiance. Her attempts to rally support through intimidation and reminders of HOA rules began to backfire. Neighbors, once obedient or fearful, were now watching her with cautious curiosity, some quietly questioning her authority for the first time in years. Every morning, Karen's routine grew more frantic. She paced the streets, stopped at driveways, and leaned over fences, speaking in hushed but urgent tones. She sought allies, attempting to exploit old grievances or imaginary infractions. Yet, the effectiveness of her campaigns waned with each passing day. I watched from the cabin porch, each movement deliberate, projecting calm and confidence. My presence alone acted as a stabilizing force, silently encouraging the residents to reconsider where their loyalties lay. Subtle shifts began to appear across the neighborhood. A few neighbors who had previously been vocal supporters of Karen now greeted me with polite nods, some even offering small gestures of assistance, clearing brush, bringing over tools, or inquiring about cabin maintenance. Others lingered on their porches, observing the unfolding events with quiet fascination. The balance of power, once so heavily skewed in her favor, now seemed to lean toward reason and legitimacy. Karen, sensing the shift, intensified her efforts. She drafted additional notices, circulated more emails, and called residents repeatedly, attempting to manufacture authority where none existed. Her language became sharper, bordering on accusatory, yet the reaction from the neighborhood was largely indifferent. Some people glanced at the papers, shook their heads, and returned to their routines. Others watched her with barely concealed amusement. Every failed attempt chipped away at the carefully curated image she had maintained for years. Meanwhile, I continued to assert presence and ownership subtly but effectively. Gardening, organizing, and repairing the cabin structure, all visible acts of stewardship, demonstrated an authority that no HOA notice could rival. The contrast between my calm, measured actions and Karen's escalating frenzy created a stark visual narrative. Residents, consciously or unconsciously, began to take notice, witnessing the power of rightful ownership firsthand. Rumors and quiet conversations spread like wildfire through the valley. "Did you see Karen today? She's losing it. I think she's overstepping." Each whisper carried a mix of curiosity and validation. People began sharing their experiences, recounting moments when her enforcement of HOA rules had seemed petty, arbitrary, or oppressive. Slowly, the community narrative shifted. Karen, once perceived as untouchable, now faced scrutiny and judgment. By midweek, her visits became intrusive and relentless. She would appear suddenly at the edge of the driveway, peering at property lines, hovering near neighbors' homes, and making notes in her frantic scrawl. Her movements were mechanical, desperate, yet entirely ineffective against the reality of ownership that I embodied. She had underestimated the subtle influence of presence, the unspoken authority that comes from legitimate control. Neighborhood dynamics continued to evolve. Families who had once tolerated her strict rules began to assert small freedoms, planting flowers without permission, repainting fences, or simply spending time outdoors without concern for scrutiny. These minor acts, almost imperceptible individually, collectively demonstrated a growing shift in power. Karen's authority, predicated on fear and intimidation, now appeared increasingly hollow. By the weekend, the tension reached its peak. Residents observed confrontations at a distance, some cautiously aligning themselves with my presence, others remaining neutral but intrigued. Karen's strategies had escalated to constant calls and confrontational visits, yet each encounter only highlighted her desperation. Her obsession with regaining control created a spectacle that drew the community's attention, revealing cracks in her long-standing dominance. Even as the valley settled into the evening, the narrative was clear. Karen's relentless pursuit of authority had alienated the very neighbors she sought to influence. My deliberate actions, calm demeanor, and visible assertion of ownership had created a new focal point in the valley, one grounded in legitimacy rather than intimidation. The balance had shifted irrevocably, and everyone could see it. By the end of the 5th day, it was undeniable, the neighborhood had turned. Karen's credibility had eroded, replaced by whispers, observation, and subtle defiance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave lasting impressions. The valley, once dominated by her authority, now pulsed with the quiet power of rightful ownership. The coming days promised resolution, or at least revelation. Karen's obsession, combined with the changing allegiances of the neighborhood, ensured that no quiet moment would remain. Every glance, every gesture, every small interaction became part of an unspoken battle over control, influence, and recognition. The valley had become a living testament to the shifting balance of power. By the 6th day, Karen's desperation had reached its peak. Every attempt at subtle intimidation had failed, and the valley had become a stage for her unraveling. She moved with an almost frantic energy, pacing the roads, clutching her clipboard, and scanning the horizon for any sign of an opening. Each step was punctuated by frustration, every gesture magnified by the knowledge that her authority was slipping away irreversibly. From the cabin porch, I observed her as the tension reached a crescendo. Karen's eyes darted between houses, measuring reactions, counting allies, and recalculating her approach with manic precision. But the valley had already shifted. Neighbors, emboldened by visible acts of rightful ownership and my deliberate calm, no longer responded to her commands or notes. Her voice, once commanding and feared, fell flat in the face of silent observation. She began knocking on doors with increasing urgency, delivering her stack of notices, explaining violations, and insisting on compliance. But each encounter seemed to accelerate her meltdown. Some residents politely refused to engage, others simply ignored her, turning the encounters into silent rebukes. Her carefully orchestrated strategy of fear and control was crumbling with every failed interaction, leaving only raw frustration. Karen's actions became more erratic. She gestured wildly, her face contorted with disbelief, shouting at imaginary infractions, or scribbling furious notes. Her obsession with regaining control had transformed into visible chaos. The clipboard, once a symbol of her perceived power, now appeared almost comical in contrast to her wild movements. The valley itself seemed to pulse with anticipation, every tree, hill, and winding road bearing witness to her collapse. The neighbors, long subdued under her oversight, began to act subtly, testing the limits of her diminished influence. Gardens were tended without permission, fences were adjusted, and children played freely in yards previously restricted. Each small act was a signal. The old hierarchy had been overturned, and Karen's authority was no longer absolute. Her meltdown, simultaneous with the assertion of ownership and community observation, became a spectacle of poetic irony. As afternoon passed, Karen's focus narrowed entirely to the cabin. She circled the property, muttering to herself, throwing her hands in the air, and occasionally stamping her feet. She seemed unable to comprehend the simple fact that the authority she had wielded so aggressively had no bearing over the rightful owner. Every inch of the cabin, every restored corner, every visible act of stewardship served as a silent, unwavering reminder that I held the ultimate power in the valley. The neighborhood watched quietly, captivated by the scene. Some residents whispered in corners, comparing stories of past enforcement to the current chaos. Others lingered near their driveways, peering out to witness the confrontation without directly engaging. Karen's meltdown became a collective spectacle, a drama unfolding in real time, her obsession laid bare for all to see. The contrast between my calm assertion and her frantic disarray highlighted the irreversible shift in power. By late afternoon, Karen's actions had escalated into total disarray. Notices were scattered, some crumpled in frustration. Her pacing became erratic, with sudden stops, sharp turns, and expressive gestures directed at the cabin as though she could intimidate the building itself. Her face alternated between disbelief, anger, and a kind of helpless rage. The valley, once a symbol of her control, had become a mirror reflecting the futility of obsession. I remained on the porch, deliberately visible, moving slowly as if to reinforce the presence and authority that had replaced her imagined control. Each motion was deliberate, tending to the garden, checking the structural repairs, and adjusting the windows to let in sunlight. Every action conveyed a simple but profound message: this property, this cabin, this valley, it belonged to me. As evening approached, Karen finally paused, leaning against a tree at the edge of the driveway. Her energy, once explosive, had diminished to trembling agitation. The reality of ownership, reinforced by the calm, deliberate presence of the rightful owner and the silent observation of the neighbors, finally began to register fully. Her defeat was not mediated through confrontation or negotiation, it was unavoidable, visible, and undeniable. By sunset, the valley had returned to its quiet rhythm, but the dynamics had permanently changed. Karen, exhausted and defeated, retreated down the winding roads, her obsession now a spent force. The neighbors, witnessing the resolution, began to return to their routines, subtly acknowledging the restored order under rightful ownership. The cabin stood tall, a beacon of legitimacy and calm authority amidst the echoes of conflict. The valley, once dominated by fear and the arbitrary power of a single individual, had shifted to reflect reality and rightful claim. Every tree, path, and hillside had witnessed the unraveling of obsession, the assertion of ownership, and the quiet triumph of patience and legitimacy. Karen had lost it completely, and the valley, my valley, was at peace once more. The cabin doors closed softly as I surveyed the land, each hill and meadow confirming the truth that had been impossible to ignore: ownership is not dictated by aggression, obsession, or intimidation. It is earned, asserted, and recognized. The valley belonged to me now, fully and undeniably, and the drama of the past week had cemented a new order for everyone to see. The stage had been set, the conflict resolved, and the neighborhood, and Karen herself, would not soon forget the moment when authority, ownership, and rightful presence had triumphed over obsession and control. The valley was mine, the cabin reclaimed, and the chapter of chaos had come to its dramatic, inevitable close.